Right now, Japan is flying here to make a deal. South Korea is flying here to make a deal, and others are flying here.
What if the country on which the US depends for its energy security decides to stop playing by Washington's rules? Amid global chaos, sharp inflation, and geopolitical threats, the US is increasing economic pressure on its closest allies. And the first to be hit are those who, it would seem, should be in a privileged position. Canada, the largest supplier of oil, gas, and uranium to the US, is now at the epicenter of a new trade conflict. Donald Trump is back, and he's back with tariffs. 35% on Canadian goods, 50% on steel and aluminum, and threats to completely replace the USMCA trade agreement.
Well, at this point, there's no there are ongoing discussions, but there's no ongoing negotiation.
This is not diplomacy. This is an ultimatum. At first glance, it may seem that Canada has no way out, a small economy against an American giant. But Ottawa has some trump cards in this game. The game is just beginning. Behind the scenes, one alarming fact remains: about 60% of all oil imports to the US come from Canada. That's millions of barrels per day. And it is precisely this oil that American refineries need, having adapted over decades to the heavy Canadian blend. Replacing this flow would disrupt the entire energy logistics within the United States.
Amazing what's happened. That's also the view on Wall Street, but in a very different way. The president not acknowledging the...
While Trump is raising the stakes and making threats, Canada is responding silently but purposefully. It is not waving flags or making loud gestures, but it is already closing its borders to cheap steel, redirecting export flows to Europe and Asia, and investing billions in modernizing its own industry. Most importantly, it is building an alternative. For the first time in decades, US allies from Canada to Brazil are uniting not under the flag of Washington, but in response to its pressure.
It's been amazing what's happened. Sometimes you have to mix it up a little bit.
We are witnessing a tectonic shift. What was supposed to strengthen America's position is actually isolating it from its traditional trade routes. China, Mexico, the EU, BRICS, everyone is watching what is happening and drawing. Trust is disappearing. And trust is a currency that can no longer be printed. So can Trump win this game? Or will he be the one who weakens US energy independence and pushes allies into the arms of new partners? Why have oil and critical minerals become the main bargaining chips in negotiations with Washington? And is Canada, which has always seemed like a junior partner, really dictating terms today?
We would be ready to negotiate after the election, which are basically in less than 3 weeks. At the same time, we want to make sure that we can negotiate not only on trade, but also on security. And we need a full partnership. But at the end of the day, what we know, Jake, is the relationship between Canada and the US will never be the same.
This issue analyzes the tough conflict between the US and Canada. What is behind the tariff war? Why is Washington risking losing not just a trading ally, but the foundation of its own energy sector? And how did Canada turn its weakness into strength? This is more than just a dispute over percentages. It is a battle for control over the future.
Yes, it's been a very tense time for the manufacturers here, Ty, because Thailand was slow to get its negotiations going.
When August 1st passed without a deal, it was not just a diplomatic failure, it was a declaration of economic war. Donald Trump, who returned to the White House under the slogan "America doesn't lose," decided that tolerance for unfair trade terms, as he put it, was over. And the first victim of his new strategy was Canada, the closest ally, neighbor, and key supplier of resources. At midnight sharp, a package of sophisticated tariffs came into force. 35% on all Canadian goods not covered by the USMCA, 50% on steel, aluminum, and 420 categories of industrial products, ranging from construction equipment to consumer electronics. Importantly, even goods that were previously considered protected by the free trade agreement were hit. This is not just politics, it is a show of force.
So we're in a campaign right now. The elections in Canada are on April 28th. The Prime Minister Carney, and President Trump had a first phone call. We said that
Canada was initially paralyzed. Unlike China or even Mexico, Ottawa was not prepared for a full-scale escalation. Its trade dependence on the US, about 72% of all exports, made the country vulnerable. Nevertheless, Prime Minister Mark Carney refused to capitulate. He did not answer the first call from Washington, waiting until the situation reached boiling point. The telephone conversation between Trudeau and Trump which took place 3 weeks after the tariffs were introduced, was not just a diplomatic act, it was a signal. Negotiations would be conducted on new terms. Ottawa's official press release called the conversation productive and frank, but no source close to the Prime Minister made any secret of the fact that tensions were running high. Trump demanded the immediate signing of a new bilateral agreement that would require the purchase of at least $50 billion worth of American cars per year, full access to Canadian water resources for American agribusiness corporations, and the elimination of export subsidies for wheat and barley producers. These demands were described as economic raiding in private briefings within the Canadian government.
Well, I think the devil really is in the detail, because it appears that the Trump administration has actually reached agreements with perhaps only about a dozen countries so far and the EU, and of those agreements, only one.
Against this backdrop, the domestic consequences in the US began to emerge faster than expected. Just 10 days after the tariffs came into force, Walmart, Target, and several other retailers warned of a sharp rise in purchase prices. Supply chains were cracking. Crane installations for US ports, whose assembly depended on Canadian components, were put on hold. Construction in Texas, Louisiana, and Pennsylvania came to a standstill, with major contractors reporting disruptions in the supply of heavy equipment. The situation with railroad cars was particularly paradoxical. Ironically, the new tariffs even hit sectors that Washington itself had declared a priority.
Is the president operating on any sort of a timeline or deadline where he wants this completed by?
Well, we always move at Trump speed here at the White House, which is incredibly fast. All options are on the table for each country, but again, these are going to be tailor-made deals. They are not going to be off-the-rack deals, as the president has called it.
According to estimates by the Yale Budget Lab, Trump's tariff policy added 2.3% to consumer prices in the country in April alone. This represents about $3,800 in additional annual expenses per household, a level higher than during the pandemic. But the medium-term forecasts looked even worse. The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco published a report in July warning that if tariffs remain in place, real incomes in the US will fall by 0.4% by 2028. Nationwide, this amounts to tens of billions of dollars in annual losses.
The first deal that was struck, that with the UK, has actually been signed. So there is a lot of detail still to be worked out here, Tig, and the devil very much in the detail potentially, because we have still, of course, agreements to be reached with...
The Center for Auto Research in Michigan added fuel to the fire. A 25% tariff on auto parts could add $18 billion to the industry's costs this year alone. For the first time in a long time, major automakers from GM to Ford began to massively revise their investment plans and postpone the launch of new models. Canadian assembly has proven to be vital, and now it is under threat. In response to all this, Trump has stepped up his rhetoric. At a rally in Ohio, he said that Canada has been taking advantage of America for years and added that it's time to pay the bills. But behind this bravado, a panicked tone was increasingly audible. The US Department of Energy acknowledged in a closed report that if Canadian oil was subject to tariffs, domestic prices could rise by 8 to 12% within 6 months. Farmers in Oklahoma and Iowa began to express their discontent. They needed Canadian fertilizers, equipment, and spare parts. Everything had become more expensive.
Well, you know, for the businesses and exporters, there is still a sense of uncertainty. They are on the edge. They don't know where they stand. So the 25% tariff for now stays, but there is also, the Trump's statement that there will be an additional penalty for India buying Russian oil and arms, and how that translates, whether it will be an additional tariff or would be that penalty would come in some other form.
And although Trump was in no hurry to acknowledge this publicly, emergency discussions on possible concessions had already begun inside the White House. One option was to temporarily exclude energy resources from the list of taxable goods, but that would have meant admitting weakness. And for Trump, who had built his entire image on the concept of strength and pressure, such a move could cost him political play. Meanwhile, Canada began to cautiously but effectively formulate a response. Although Carney refused to mirror the tariff increases in full, his team delivered targeted blows. A 25% duty on American beverages, motorcycles, food products, and consumer electronics hit not just the US economy, but also electorally important states. Whiskey producers in Kentucky, breweries in Colorado, and farms in Wisconsin all began to complain about declining orders. The media leaked information that Canada was also preparing a scenario of quiet escalation, a gradual restriction on purchases of American goods in the public sector, including infrastructure projects. This measure could have affected up to $16 billion in purchases per year. This move was not officially announced, but major US contractors began to notice a slowdown in contracting with Canadian agencies. It was subtle but effective pressure. Against a backdrop of mutual recriminations, rising prices, and a growing diplomatic ice age, the trade confrontation between the US and Canada quickly went beyond the economy. This is no longer just a dispute over percentages or agreements. It is a clash between two models. On the one hand, there is a strategy of force, pressure, and threats. On the other, there is a wait-and-see approach, cold calculation, and the targeted exploitation of the opponent's weaknesses. It is not yet clear who will win, but there are already losers, and Canada is increasingly not among them. When the pressure from Washington became unbearable, Canada did not resort to emotional retaliation. Unlike many countries that act in a mirror image in such circumstances, Ottawa chose a different strategy, a long game. It not only refused to escalate immediately, but also turned its attention to its real levers of influence. The main one was a resource without which the US economy cannot survive: energy.
The key trading partner, China, which of course at one stage the United States was threatening to impose tariffs of 145% on. Well, since then there's been a trade negotiation truce, if you like. Those negotiations, key negotiations, due to continue in a few weeks' time.
Every day, about 4 million barrels of oil come to the US from Canada. That is about 2/3 of all oil supplies coming into the country from abroad. But it is not even the volume that matters, but the specific nature of the oil. The oil produced in Alberta is heavy and thick, ideally suited to American refineries in the Midwest, which have historically been adapted to this particular type of crude. The only alternative to this oil is Venezuela, but that country is under sanctions. Saudi Arabia and Iraq export lighter grades that are not compatible with American equipment. Russian oil is banned, leaving Canada as the only option in this equation. This is not a theoretical threat, it is a point of pressure that Ottawa has been studying for years, but has only now begun to use with the utmost caution and precision. The Canadian government did not impose direct restrictions on supplies, as this could have been seen as aggression. Instead, it began working on infrastructure. The Ministry of Natural Resources suddenly initiated a large-scale inspection of the technical condition of pipelines, including Trans Mountain, Keystone, and Enbridge Line 3. Under the pretext of ensuring safety, operators were ordered to limit pumping volumes by 3 to 5% until the inspections were completed. This measure, which was not officially linked to trade disputes, caused a sharp jump in raw material prices on US exchanges. In mid-September, the price of a barrel of WCS Western Canadian Select rose by 14% in a week. At the same time, certification for the expansion of the Nenkel gas pipeline, which carried more than 8 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day to the US, was temporarily frozen. This coincided with the start of the heating season, and a shortage immediately arose on the US market. Natural gas futures jumped 9% in 2 days. Information about this was deliberately released in small doses, but a leak from one of Canada's regulatory agencies made it clear this was no accident, it was a signal. In parallel with energy, Canada turned its attention to another, less discussed but strategically important sector: critical minerals. Nickel, cobalt, lithium, rare earth elements, all of these are necessary not only for the production of electric vehicles, but also for the military industry, satellites, navigation systems, and even microprocessors. According to an internal analysis conducted in early 2025, Canada ranks third in the world in lithium reserves, and is among the top 5 in terms of rare earth element processing. Over the past 2 years, these supplies have accounted for up to 27% of US demand in these categories, especially against the backdrop of a shift away from imports from China. After relations with Washington deteriorated, the Canadian Ministry of Trade began reviewing export licenses for these materials. Formally, this was done under the pretext of environmental compliance, but in fact, delays in issuing new permits began to take effect within a month. One of the largest U.S. defense contractors, Vector Aerospace Systems, which is working on upgrading drones for the Pentagon, was forced to postpone the launch of a new production line due to a shortage of cobalt supplied from Canada. But all this happened without any fuss or fanfare. Carney did not hold a press conference or accuse Washington of aggression. Instead, he consistently and coolly strengthened Canada's position in other areas. One of the key steps was to intensify trade negotiations with South Korea, India, and the European Union. In July, an agreement was reached with Germany on priority supplies of lithium and cobalt in exchange for investment in Canadian processing. South Korea agreed to build a battery assembly plant in Quebec using exclusively Canadian components, which had previously been shipped to the US. At the same time, Ottawa announced the creation of a special energy diversification fund, to which $3.6 billion was allocated. These funds were used to modernize ports on the Pacific coast to increase oil and gas exports to Asia. By 2026, Canada plans to double the number of LNG tankers to South Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. Washington is watching this closely and understands that Canada's strategy is not a desperate move, but a structural shift. The Canadian government's decision to introduce energy conditions into the negotiation process has caused particular concern in the US. This means that any trade concessions that Canada is willing to discuss will now be directly linked to issues of access to its energy and mineral resources. In other words, if the US wants tariffs on cars or agricultural products to be revised, it must guarantee long-term stability in energy relations, and not just promises legally binding mechanisms to protect exports, including compensation in the event of unilateral termination of agreements. Mark Carney made it clear that oil, gas, and minerals are not just resources, they are national security assets, and Canada will not allow them to be used as bait in other countries' trade games. Moreover, in September, Parliament began considering a bill prohibiting the sale of strategic deposits and energy infrastructure to foreign countries without the approval of two-thirds of MPs. This move was aimed not so much at the US, at China and Saudi Arabia, but the effect was universal. Canada began to build its energy independence not on paper, but in reality. Thus, instead of vacillating between threats and concessions, Canada did what no one expected. It turned its energy vulnerability into geopolitical strength. While Trump was intimidating the world with tariffs, Canada rewrote the rules. And now it is dictating the terms, not loudly, not aggressively, but with no right to be ignored. The domino effect triggered by US tariff policy has gone far beyond the bilateral conflict between the US and Canada. What began as an attempt by Washington to put pressure on its closest neighbor has turned into a large-scale geopolitical restructuring. Allies that for decades had looked to the US as an anchor of stability have begun to break away into alternative blocs. Whereas they used to compete for privileges within the American sphere of influence, they are now competing to break free from it. Paradoxically, it is Donald Trump's tough style that has become the catalyst for regional and even global unity, only not around the US, but against its pressure. One of the first signs was the statement made by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum against the backdrop of Washington's notification of new tariffs, 35% for Canada and 30% for Mexico, if a new agreement is not signed by August 1st. Instead of trying to negotiate separately, the two leaders held a joint press conference at which they publicly pledged to strengthen bilateral cooperation and create regional supply chains that are not dependent on the whims of a single country. This marked the beginning of what journalists quickly dubbed a NAFTA 2.0, without the US an informal platform aimed at preserving integration between the two countries without Washington's participation. This was followed by concrete steps. Canada announced the creation of an Economic Diversification Council, which includes the Ministers of Trade, Energy, Defense, and Finance. The Council's first task is to develop a scheme for trade routes that will bypass the US. In July, Ottawa and Mexico City signed an agreement on the priority transport of goods through new logistics hubs on the Pacific coast, including ports in Manzanillo, Mexico, and Prince Rupert, British Columbia. This has enabled the creation of an autonomous North American supply chain, from Canadian raw materials to Mexican assembly and delivery to Asia. Europe has not stood idly by either. After the US officially notified the EU in April of its introduction of 30% tariffs on industrial goods, negotiations on a new trade pact were frozen indefinitely, according to European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Germany and France have stepped up their economic dialogue with Canada, launching work on the Atlantic Reset program, a large-scale project to restore transatlantic trade without relying on the US. Among the first steps is the accelerated approval of agreements on mutual recognition of technical standards and certifications, which had previously been blocked by bureaucratic mechanisms in Washington.